Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this one we're going to be painting a woman using watercolors, and I wanted to go through a tutorial on how to paint a darker skin tone. So here you can see the final painting that we're going to be working on, and this tutorial is split into 4 different parts, and the first part we're going to be going through is how to paint the skin. And I definitely think the skin can be one of the most challenging parts of painting a realistic portrait. This painting is mostly going to be done in watercolor, but I will use a little bit of color pencil at the end just to add a bit of detail and definition. Now this portrait is in a realistic style and also an expressive style, especially the hair. So let's get into the first part, which is going to be painting the skin, and I'm going to be mixing up 3 different colors. So I'm starting off by mixing a really light tone, which is going to be the base color. And to get a light tone, you want to mix in some more water so that it's really nice and diluted. Now the colors I'm mixing for this first color is yellow ochre and burnt umber. And you can add a little bit of Indian red or a reddish tone if you want to give a more red pinkish tinge to the skin. But this is going to be our lightest color, which we're going to use for a base tone. And I try and match this color to the lightest highlight in the skin. And then we'll also need to build up a more shadowed color for the shadows in her skin as well. And for the darker colour, I'm just using those exact same 3 colours, the yellow ochre, the burnt umber, which is like a light sort of brown tone, and the Indian red to give more of a rich red tone to the skin. And just keep mixing them in combination, adding a bit more yellow ochre if it's too red, and adding a bit more brown if it's a bit too light. And I recommend having a little scrap piece of paper next to you so that you can test your colours and keep going until you're happy that you've got a colour that pretty much matches with the reference. But don't worry if it doesn't match exactly with the reference, try to just get the values right. Try and get a shadowed colour and a lighter colour for our base wash. Now, as always, the reference image and the sketch outline are attached so you can follow along with this tutorial, and all of the materials will be listed in the description as well if you want to check over those colours that I'm using again. Now the third colour I'm mixing is just going to be more of a reddish tone, which we can use for her cheeks where it's a bit more of a blush colour, and for some of those shadows. So this is just going to be mainly the Indian red. But I just wanted that on a separate palette. So now we're going to start off with the first colour that we've mixed. So this was the yellow ochre mixed with a bit of the burnt umber and just quite a lot of water to really dilute it down. And I'm going to add this as a base wash all over her skin. So I'm just using a round watercolour paintbrush to do this. And you want to work quite fast so that you don't get any harsh outlines from where you're sort of doing it in different sections. And I'm being careful to go around the eye because areas like the white of the eye we don't want to get too dark with this brown tone. Like I said, I'm just carefully going to add this as a base wash all over the skin. I'm even going to go over the lips. The only areas I'm missing out are the eyes. And you can go ahead and add this to the neck and the shoulder as well. So just add this wherever you can see skin in the reference image. And I'm going to repeat that process. And so that is the first step, and I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. So as you can see, the colour is a lot lighter than it is in the reference, but that is okay because this is just our base wash. So this tone really just needs to match the lightest areas that we can see in the skin, so the highlighted areas. And the reason why you want to start off light is because with watercolours it's really hard to lift up highlights if you've added too much watercolour in a certain area. So I like to build up my washes in layers, starting from light washes and then gradually building up those darker tones. And as you can see, we've got a really nice first wash all over the skin, and we've got a really nice base layer to build on top of. Now, whilst the first layer is still wet, I'm going to take a little bit of that shadowed colour, and you can mix it in with the base tone so it's not too dark. And I'm just going to work this throughout some of the darkest areas that we can see on the skin. Now don't do this if your first layer has already dried, because you're going to get really harsh edges. So if your first layer of paint has already dried, that first wash, then I would just go over it with some clean water to wet that surface again and then add in the shadows, because we want to use a wet on wet technique when we paint skin. What I mean by a wet on wet technique is you basically want to add your paint to a wet surface. So whether that's a previous wash that's still wet, like our base colour, or whether you let the watercolour dry and then add a layer of water to pre-wet the surface of the paper again and then add the paint. It doesn't matter. Either way, we just need the surface to be wet before we add more paint so that it bleeds out and gives us a really nice soft look, and we don't get any harsh lines, because if we're trying to paint something realistically, we want to have smooth skin. We want to have transitions, nice gradual transitions between our different skin colours, our different shadows in the skin. So we need to use the wet on wet technique. Now, as for where the shadows are, I'm mainly working on the neck at the moment. The neck tends to be darker than the face in most references. Obviously, it depends on your light source. And it's important to get the shadows in the correct place so that the portrait looks 3D and it looks like it has some dimension to it and depth to it. Otherwise, if you don't add the shadows or the highlights in the right place, it means that you won't have enough contrast, and so your painting will look very flat. So it's very important to get your shadows in where they need to be. My painting was starting to dry, so I waited for it to completely dry, and now I'm going over the face with some clean water again, just to pre-wet the surface of that paper. And you only need to add water if the paper is completely dry. If it's sort of half dry, make sure you wait for it to completely dry before you pre-wet the paper with water again. So that's all I'm doing. I'm not adding any more colour at the moment. I'm just wetting the whole of the face, making sure to miss out the teeth and the eyes again. I'm just making sure the neck is wet as well. And make sure every part of the paper is wet on the face. Make sure you don't miss any edges. Now, you don't want a huge puddle of water to form on the paper. So wait until it's just nice and glistening. As you can see where her mouth is, it's got a nice shine to it, but you don't want puddles forming. And so now I'm taking a bit of that darker paint, so the second colour that we mixed up at the top of the palette, and I'm just going to start to add this wherever I can see shadows in the face. So particularly around the side of the face, where the cheekbone is, like I said, for the neck and under the chin and the jawline. Also, there's a little bit of shadow usually under the lips and sort of curving around to form the shape of the chin. And with this reference, the left hand side of her face was in a little more shadow, very subtly in a little more shadow than the right hand side of her face. So you can see that I added a bit of shadow to the left hand side by the mouth and by the nose. I'm also adding some of that shadowed colour just above and below the eyes, so between the eye and the eyebrow, and I'm going to repeat that with the other eye as well. And you can see how the colours are nicely bleeding out to give us a really soft effect. Also look for the really subtle shadows, for example, the smile lines next to the nose. They're really important to give the person that you're drawing the right expression on their face. Now try not to rush this, because it doesn't matter if you don't finish the layer. If it starts to dry, you can keep waiting for it to dry and then re-wet it and carry on, so you can build it up in layers. Try not to rush it, because it's very important that you get the shadows in the right place, so you may need to study your reference a little bit. And I find it so easy to paint skin using the wet on wet technique. I'm creating the shadows around the nose, and if it's just a subtle shadow, just pick up a tiny bit of that shadowed colour onto your brush. Don't pick up loads of that darker colour if it's just a tiny, really subtle shadow. For the really dark shadows though, you do want to pick up more of that paint on your brush to make it more intense. Also, one thing to remember is watercolours do dry a lot lighter and a bit more desaturated than they look when they're wet. So even though the skin may look really yellow at the moment and you may think the colours are too dark that you're using, remember it does dry a little bit lighter and a little bit more dull than it looks when it's wet. So just continue to build up the shadows, either until you're happy that you've got in all of the shadows or until the paper starts to dry. If you're happy with the shadows, then you can wait to move on to the next step, or if your paper's starting to dry, wait for it to completely dry and then re-wet it. You can also speed up the drying process using a hairdryer. I use it on a cool setting, but don't use that if you have loads of water down or if it's really wet, because it could spread the paint and mess up all of your shadows. I only use it if it's nearly dry and I just want to speed up that process a bit more. I make sure to keep checking my reference. I check my reference as much as I look at my painting to make sure I've got those shadows in the right place. And try not to rush the skin, because this part is the most time-consuming part of the whole painting. Once you've done the skin, the other parts are quite quick actually, but it's the layering for the skin and mixing the skin tones and really paying attention to this part of the painting that is so time-consuming. Painting the skin takes way over half of the whole painting time. So it's worth really paying attention and focusing on this, because if you don't do the skin right, then the whole painting will look strange. But if you do the skin really nice and perfect and you really focus on it, then it will make the whole piece look so much better. And remember, we're building it up in layers, starting from the lightest layer and then gradually getting darker. So even with this layer, I've not got it as dark as I need it to be. And with each layer, I'll just take it that step further and get in the darker shadows, because with this painting, it's not like there's either those really bright highlights as we had in our base layer. It's not just really bright highlights or really dark shadows. We've got all of those in between values. And to create contrast, you want to use lots of different values from the value scale. So we don't just want really bright highlights and then really dark shadows. We need to have these mid-tones in there, and we need to gradually build it up to darker shadows so that we have a lot of different tones in there. And just adding some more shadow to the side of the nose. As the watercolour starts to dry as well, it will spread out more because the surface of the paper is wet, and so the shadows may become more diffused and not as strong and defined as you want them to be, so you may need to go back over certain shadows and just tweak them. For example, I'm going over the shadows again for the nose and just adjusting them. And also, when your painting dries, it tends to dry a bit softer than it looks when it's wet as well, I've noticed. I'm just using a clean damp brush at the moment just to smooth out any harsh edges if it's not getting as smooth as you want it to. And use a clean damp brush, not a wet brush, because if it's too wet, then the water, if there's too much water on your brush, it will create like cauliflower blooming effects. So you just want a damp brush if you're trying to soften out any edges. Now it's time to repeat that same process with the shoulder. So I'm starting off by pre-wetting the whole of the arm shoulder area. And I'm then going to mix up that shadowed colour again using the yellow ochre, burnt umber, and you can use a bit of the Indian red if you want as well. Now with the arm, with this shoulder area, it was the most shadowed around the sides and at the top, and then the highlight was in the middle of the arm and shoulder. So it's darkest around the edges and then gets gradually lighter and lighter as we go towards the middle. And having the highlight in the center and then it being darker around the outside is what's going to give it more of that 3D look to it and give it that rounded look as well. So I'm just adding the shadow all the way around the edge of the arm and the shoulder. Remember to pre-wet with some clean water the arm shoulder area so that the colours that we're adding now bleed out and soften out into the rest. And I'm just pulling that shadow gradually into the centre of the arm so that we can get that natural transition from it being darkest around the edges to being lighter towards the middle. And you can see that already just by adding this little shadow in there, the arm has a lot more dimension and more of a 3D look than it did with that first base wash down. Because the first base wash was just one colour, it just looked very flat. Whereas now we're adding in shadows and we've got the highlight in the middle, it has got more of a rounded look to it and it pops out a lot more. And so whilst the surface of the paper is still wet, I'm gradually going to build up more and more shadows by adding more of that pigment down to the darkest areas. Make sure to preserve those highlights, don't accidentally go in and add the paint to your lightest areas. And I'm just blending out that paint towards the middle of the arm. I'm gonna build up a few more shadows, get it a bit darker, right in those darkest places on the reference. And so I'm just gonna build up the shadows until I'm happy with this layer. So I'm just going to spend a couple more minutes just adding some more of the shadow to the darkest areas. And I'm also going to build up another layer of shadow just below the chin, so on the neck. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. So once you've finished those areas, it's now time to wait for that layer to dry. And before we pre-wet the surface of that paper again, I'm just going to mix up 3 more colours for this next step. So this time I'm going to mix up an even darker colour, and again I'm going to be using the yellow ochre and the burnt umber. But as well as that, I'm going to mix in some sepia, which is a really dark brown, to make it one step darker. And I'm also going to mix in a little bit of the Indian red as well. Just a tiny bit though, because it's mainly quite a golden undertone to the skin. So I'm only mixing in a little bit of Indian red just to give it more of a rich colour. And add more hues into the skin tone so it's not just all yellow undertoned. And because we're trying to get this colour even darker, you want to mix in less and less water. So when you try to get darker colours, don't add in as much water because the water really dilutes that pigment and gives it a lighter look. So because we're going to be doing more of the hues and glazing in some more vibrant colours, I'm going to mix up that reddish pink colour using the Indian red, and I'm also going to mix up just some yellow ochre so that where there's really pink parts of the skin like the cheeks, and where there's more yellow tones throughout the skin on some of the shadows, for example, we can go in and just tap in some of these brighter colours. So the yellow ochre isn't so fake looking, I did mix in a tiny bit of the burnt umber just to make it look more natural. And so now it's just time to go in with some clean water and pre-wet the skin again. Make sure if your water jar is a bit dirty, keep swapping it so that you have nice clean water so that you don't accidentally add a tint or another wash to the skin. So I'm just going to go and pre-wet the whole of the skin again. Now that we've finished wetting the paper, I'm going to start off by going in with the middle colour that we mixed, so the yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of the burnt umber. And I'm just going to add this to all of the areas that I want to make a little more golden toned, so that I want to make a little more vibrant. So I'm starting off with the top of the face, so going around the side of the forehead, I'm also going above the eyes, and I just want to give it a bit more of a vibrant look to the skin because like I said, when it dries the watercolours can look a little more dull, so I wanted to bring some more vibrancy to the skin. And mainly I'm adding this over where the shadows are because the really dark parts of the skin tone can look really vibrant, especially in the reference. Whereas I didn't go in with this colour where the brightest highlights were in the skin. I just want to keep the highlighted areas as that first base wash that we added in. I'm also adding some of that yellow ochre over the nose, and this is just a tinting wash. So you can see now how much more vibrant the face looks. So now I'm going to go in with a clean damp brush and I'm just going to lift up some of the paint from where the brightest areas were. So if you accidentally add a bit too much watercolour on some of the highlighted areas, go in with a clean damp brush like I'm doing now, and you can easily lift up some of that watercolour because the paintbrush will absorb the watercolour, and this will help get some of those highlights back. And you can see that I'm cleaning off my brush in between uses on a bit of tissue to make the paintbrush dry again so that it's able to lift up even more watercolour. And like I said, just use a clean damp brush for this and it will really easily pull up some highlights. And when the brush has picked up some of that colour, wipe it on a bit of tissue so that you can go in again and lift up even more watercolour. If your paintbrush gets a bit dirty, as it will after a few uses, you can go and clean it again so that you're not accidentally adding paint back into your highlighted areas. Now it's time to build up even more shadows, so I'm going in with that top colour, the darkest colour that we mixed up, and I'm going to start adding this to the darkest areas in the reference, particularly around the sides of the face, where that cheekbone is as well. The contour for the cheek and also by the jawline, and there's quite a bit of shadow on the right hand side of the face. And we're just really adding this colour to all of the areas that we added shadows to at the start. We're just trying to make these areas even darker. And as we get to use darker and darker colours, we're not going to need to use them on as many areas as we did with the midtones or the first wash. So with the first wash, we added it everywhere. And then we went to a slightly darker wash, which we added in quite a lot of areas, but not everywhere. We added it everywhere but the brightest highlights. And then we went on to using this shadowed colour, and again we're going to be adding it to even less areas. So we're just adding this to areas of the skin that need to go even darker. Once again, be careful not to go over any of the highlighted areas. But now you know a trick for if you do accidentally add too much paint to the lighter areas of the skin. Now you can use that clean damp brush to go and lift up some of that extra paint. But it only works whilst the paint is still wet. I'm really building up more shadow above the eyes. And in the second part of this tutorial, we're going to be building up the details for the facial features. And that's where everything starts to come together. So don't worry if your painting is looking a little strange at the moment. Mine looks a little strange at the moment too, but as you go through these different parts, it starts to all come together. So I'm just going to work my way around the face. I'll be adding some shadow below the mouth and up the left hand side of the face, around the chin. Once again, if your paper is starting to dry, wait for it to dry and then re-wet it again with some clean water and carry on with your layering. It's not worth rushing it, because if your paper is dry and you try to add another layer, it's really hard to blend out and avoid harsh outline. It's just easier to wait for it to completely dry. I've made that mistake many times in the past, where I just rush in with the next layer whilst the paper's starting to dry, and I always regret it. It's always quicker just to wait for it to dry rather than having to try and fix mistakes. Now let's build up those shadows under the chin. So let's build up shadows on the neck. To really make the face stand out, we need to make the neck look darker so that the face pops more. And again, give that a 3D look. We want the neck to look set further back and the face to be brought forward. So to bring the face forward, we need to have it lighter, have more highlights, and we need the neck to be darker because the face is casting a shadow on the neck. It's not letting the light get to it as much, so it needs to be a bit darker. If you're unsure where the shadows are in the skin, you might find it easier to turn your photo into black and white, turn it into a monochrome scale so it's easier to judge where the darkest values are. And so I'm just going to continue to spend the next couple of minutes just building up the shadows in the same way that I've been doing, using the same technique, going over all of the areas that I added shadows to in the previous layer and just add in this darker colour. So I'll be working around the nose area and softening out any areas that I need to even more using a clean damp brush. So I'll see you guys in a few minutes where we move on to the next step. Now that I've added in the shadows around the nose, and I'm just finishing off blending out the shadows for the side of the nose, I'm going to move on in a second to blocking in the shape of the eyebrows, and I'm just going to block in where the eyebrows are. I'm not going to add in any details, that will be for the next part in this tutorial series, but I'm just going to be blocking them in with the light brown tone, just the general shape of where they are. First, I'm just adding a little bit more shadow underneath the nose. And as you can see, the nose looks a lot more 3D now because we've added some more shadows around it. We left the highlight at the tip of the nose, and also there's a highlight in the middle of the nose. But you can see we've done a shadow going across the sort of going horizontally just above the tip of the nose, and there's also some shadows right around the sides of the middle of the nose. Now I'm going to go in with that lighter brown, and like I said, I'm just painting in where the shape of the eyebrows is, and hopefully you should still be able to vaguely see your sketch outline peeping through your watercolor sketch, so that you can see where the eyebrows need to go. If not, carefully look at the reference and potentially go back in with graphite and just sketch it in before you go in with paint if you're scared that you're going to ruin your painting and make a mistake. And that's all I wanted to do with the eyebrows, just block them in so that when we add the details, we've got a nice foundation underneath, so that we can go in and add details, but it still looks like there's a lot of fullness to the eyebrow. So now I'm just going back to tweaking the shadows. And it does look strange at the moment because we haven't done the eyes or the lips. We will be working on painting in the lips in a minute. In the next sort of parts. So now I'm going to start to work on the body, so the skin for the body, for the arm. I'm starting off by painting the bit of skin just in front of the arm here for her body, and I'm painting this with the really dark brown because this area of skin is in a lot of shadow. So I'm just going straight in with that dark brown, and I'm mainly putting it along the top because it does get a tiny bit lighter down the bottom of that section of skin. But I'm only leaving a little area at the bottom for it to be lighter. We're mainly adding that really dark brown everywhere. Now I'm just blending the shadow towards the bottom so that it's a gradual transition. Now I'm wetting the neck area so that we can build up some shadows for this section. So also, because I want it to be an expressive style, I want to keep the face quite realistic, but around the body, around the hair, we want it to be expressive. You can see that I bled out part of the skin for her back to give it more of that loose, expressive style. So I just did it in that little area, but little things like that is what's going to give it a expressive style as well. And like I said, I'm building up some shadows for the neck and down her back, because the hair is casting a shadow onto the neck and onto the skin for the top of the shoulders. That's why it's darker as well. I'm really careful when I paint in the shadow for the neck. I make sure to get the shape of the face right, the shape of the chin and the jawline. You can see how getting in these darker shadows really adds a lot more contrast to the painting. So I'm just going to continue to build up some shadow around the body and around the neck until I'm happy with it, and then we'll be moving on to adding the shadow to the rest of the arm and to the top of the shoulder. I'm also going back to the face, and now that the face is starting to dry, we can see any areas that we need to darken up even more. For example, the nostrils, which are the darkest part of the nose, so we need to make sure that we're getting the nostrils as dark as they need to be. And you can also do a dark line around the side of the face, so for the colour of the hair around the face, so that it's easier to judge the skin tone. It's easier to judge the skin tone if you've got the colour down that's surrounding it, so the really dark black for the hair. Now I'm just glazing a little bit of that pinky tone that we mixed up, that third colour, and just blending that onto the cheeks. And this makes the skin look more lifelike, gives it more of a healthy glow. Adding in different hues really helps to give it more of a realistic look. Once again, I'm just going to blend out the edges with the clean damp brush if you need to. And I'm just going to repeat this process until I've added this pink red tone to all of the areas that it appears in the reference, particularly over the darkest shadows and along the cheeks, like I said. So I'm just adding it a bit around the forehead. I'm also adding in a little brown to transition between that dark outline and the forehead a bit better. So having that outline around the side of the face made me realise that we needed to go darker. So it's really helpful. And I'm adding a bit of that pink tone to the nose. Now we're going to move on to adding the shadows to the arm. So I'm going in with some clean water and just pre-wetting the whole of this area of skin, making sure not to miss out any sections, otherwise we will get harsh edges. Now I'm going back in with that darkest colour that we mixed up, and I'm just targeting that around the sides of the arm. So again, in the exact same position, in the exact same place that we added the shadows to in previous layers. I'm gradually going to get darker and darker, add darker and darker paint. And there is a really dark shadow right at the top of the shoulder that I want to darken up. And this is the final step before we're finished with the skin. And so in the next part we'll be working on adding in the details. Now I'm going in with a bit of the Indian red to give more of a pink tinge, more of a reddish tone to the skin to match with the rest of the skin. Now I'm gradually picking up more and more of that really dark brown that we mixed up, using the yellow ochre, burnt umber and the sepia to get in those really dark values. Because the darkest areas of the arm and the shoulder do match with the darkest areas of the rest of the face and of the neck. So where you can see the really dark shadow for the neck, there is a couple of these really dark shadows throughout this area that we're working on, particularly right around the sides of the arm, around where the shirt is, where her top is, meeting with the skin on the right hand side, and at the top of that shoulder as well. So that is it for the skin. In part 2, we're going to work on painting in the details for the face. For painting in the details, we're going to start by working at the top of the face and work our way down. So we're going to start off with the eyebrows. And to paint in all of these details, I'm simply going to be using the dark brown colour that we mixed up because she's got very dark eyes and dark eyebrows. So you'll want to use a colour that's got the burnt umber in, but mainly it's got a lot of the sepia mixed in as well, so that we've got a really nice dark natural brown, and I want to create as dark of a brown as I can without having to add in any black, so that we're keeping it a nice rich natural colour. And I'm simply going in with a smaller round paintbrush, and I'm starting to paint in all of the details for the eyebrows. And I'm painting in individual eyebrow hairs, and I'm making sure to really focus on the reference and focus on where which sort of direction the eyebrows are growing in, and the way they curve and how thick and full they are, whether there's any individual sparse eyebrows in the sort of inner corner of the eyebrow, how the eyebrows grow down from the top and how they grow up from the bottom. And I also am going to start to go in and outline around the top of the eye. We will be adding in all of the eyelashes as well later on. I'm also getting in the little bit of eyelid that we can see. Now I'm going to be working on adding in the shadows around where the waterline is, just around the side of the white of the eye. And you can see that now when we're doing details, we don't want the surface of the paper to be wet. When we're painting in individual details, we want them to be sharp and crisp. So if the surface of the paper was wet, the details will bleed out and create a soft look, and that's not what we want. When we paint in details, we want them to be defined, which means that if we want defined details, we need to paint them on a dry surface. So make sure before you do this step, you wait for your previous layers for the skin to completely dry. And I've switched to a smaller paintbrush because we're getting in these tiny details. And that means because we don't have to work whilst the paper's wet, you can really take your time with this. There's no rush because you haven't got any sort of time limit or restriction. So now moving on to painting in the iris. First, I'm outlining around the shape of the iris. And because our eyes are really dark, I'm going to be pretty much adding in this dark brown paint absolutely everywhere, apart from the couple of tiny highlights that we can see in the eyes. Those couple of highlights I'm painting around and trying to preserve them. But you can always add them in with a white gel pen or coloured pencil later on. Because we will be going in with colour pencils later on to add in a bit of definition, just a little bit at the end. Just spend a couple minutes adding in some details. Most of the work is done really with the watercolours though. So you can see that I just added that dark brown absolutely everywhere apart from those couple of highlighted areas. Now I'm going to very carefully paint in a couple of eyelashes, again focusing on the reference to see the way the eyelashes curve. Where is there the most eyelashes? They tend to be fuller on the outside of the eye and then get thinner towards the inner corner of the eye. Also the bottom eyelashes are sparser than the upper eyelashes. Also look at the length of the eyelashes as well and look to see if they overlap each other. I try not to do my eyelashes straight, otherwise they will look too cartoony. Give them a bit of a curve to make them look natural. And to get really thin lines, try not to have too much paint on your brush. So dab off the excess paint, just have a little bit on your brush, and this will help you to get really thin lines, really thin detailed eyelashes. So that's pretty much it for this eyebrow and for the eye. Now I'm just going to tweak anything that I feel like I need to with this area. So I'm just going to darken up the side of the nose. So getting in these really dark areas like the eyebrow and the eye may make you notice other sections like on the side of the nose which do need to go a bit darker. You may need to darken up the nostrils as well, like I'm doing. So it's okay to go back to the skin and tweak areas if you feel like they need to go a little bit darker. But I'm just tweaking the detailed areas. It'll be hard now to go in and create another layer for the skin because we've already got in all of the details over the top. And re-wetting the whole of the skin would smudge those details. So I'm just going to finish tweaking this eye. And now I'm going to repeat the exact same process with the other eye, starting off by going in and painting in all of the detailed hairs for the eyebrow. Doing this in a very similar way as I do the eyelashes. So going in with a small brush, just doing little strokes, going with the direction the eyebrow hairs are growing in. Again, you want to do them curved, you don't want to do straight lines, otherwise they will look spiky and cartoony. So give them a natural curve. And I'll repeat the same process with the eye as I did with the eye on the left hand side. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. With this reference, there's also a couple of bits of hair overlapping onto this right eye, so I'm just adding a few little wisps of hair crossing over onto the eye. And I'm not following the reference too closely when I'm doing them. I just make sure to do them with a lot of wave and make them really curly, because she has got afro hair, so obviously the hair needs to be very curly. So you don't want to do straight pieces of hair overlapping the eyes. And the hair's pretty much covering a lot of the outer corner of the eye. A lot of the right hand side of the eye. Adding a bit of shadow underneath the eye as well. And again, that's pretty much it for this eye. Now we can move on to the next part. Just going to add a little bit of shadow underneath the left eye. And just darken up above the left eye. Bringing that shadow further down the left hand side of the face. Be very careful when trying to add more layers to the skin. It's easier to work on this little area of skin because it's quite cut off, so there's a nice harsh outline where it meets the nose, and then where it meets the eye, and then round the side of the mouth, so it's its own little section. I'm adding a bit of a red tint towards where the tear duct is and underneath the right eye. I'm building up some dark shadow underneath the right eye as well. So you can continue just to make a few tweaks until you're happy with how the details for the eyes are looking. And we're pretty much done the nose, so we don't have to worry about the nose. But we will need to move on and work on the lips and the teeth. Okay, so now we're going to move on. And we're going to work on the lips. I'm going to start off by taking that dark brown, that same dark brown that we used for the eyes, and I'm going to work this in between the teeth, so where you can see the really dark shadows where the mouth's open, I'm adding in all of the darkest shadows between the teeth and where the tongue is. There are a couple of areas inside the mouth that are more of that pinkish tone, so I'm not adding the sepia everywhere inside of the mouth where the mouth's open. I'm adding it at the outer corner and both corners of the mouth, and as you can see, mainly to outline the teeth. So now I'm mixing up the colour for the lips, and I'm just using that Indian red. You can mix in a bit of a more pinkish red tone to make it a bit more vibrant if you want to. And I'm just going to spread this colour all over the lips as a base tone, starting off by working on the bottom lip and then moving on to the top lip. And like I said, I'm just going to add this over the whole of the mouth as a base layer. Now I've got a bit of that darker brown colour on my brush, and I'm just tapping this over the top of that first wash to the lips that we've added in, particularly on the left hand side of the mouth, just to add in some shadow, because the left hand side of the mouth is in more shadow than the right hand side, particularly on that top lip. So I just tapped in a bit of that darker brown just to create a darker red tone. to add more of a 3D look to the lips. It's very important that you get the shadows in where they need to be. So just work that sepia, that darker brown colour, anywhere where you can see shadows in the reference where the lips need to go darker. I'm also going in with that sepia and adding another layer around the teeth if you notice that you need to make that even darker. So now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to build up the shadow around the side of the mouth a bit more, just darken up the shadow just under the nose again. I noticed that that needs to be darker, but the lips were quite simple. You can add a light wash of brown or a very, very diluted wash of black, like tiny bit of black, a lot of water, to give a more grey look to the teeth. But I think they look fine as they are. Really darkening up to the side of the mouth though. You can see how much of a difference adding those few details has made to the face. Such a massive difference. Now there isn't really any details that we need to add to the arms or to the shoulders and neck. Most of the details are just to the face. I'm also adding a bit more shadow just under the lips. Define the bottom of the lips a bit more to make the mouth pop. And at the moment we haven't used any black. We've just used the dark sepia, the sepia, for the dark shadows. So just continue to tweak these features and the shadows in the skin until you're happy with how the portrait is looking. Going back in and just adding a bit more shadow between the teeth. But that is it for all of the details for the face, and so in the next part we're going to start to work on the hair. So in this part we're mainly going to be working on painting in the expressive hair, but we're quickly going to first go in and paint in her clothing. So I'm using a very diluted wash of black, and I'm just using this to very roughly paint in where the shadows are for the clothing. And I'm being very expressive with this. The hair and the clothing are elements that I like to be very expressive and loose with. And you can see that I did a couple of splatters and just blended over where the clothes are on the right hand side of the clothing to really give it an expressive look. And I'm just tapping in a little bit of purple whilst that wash is still wet, just to give a bit more colour and vibrancy to the clothing. I'm tapping in some darker shadows and using the wet on wet method and tapping in these other colours within that first wash, that really light grey wash, really helps to add to that expressive look. And that's all I'm going to do with the right hand side of the clothing. As you can see, really simple, and I'm just going to repeat this process for the other section of clothing. Again, starting with that very light wash of grey and marking in the darkest shadows. Also, because her clothing's white and the background is white unlike the reference, I'm adding some shadow to the outside of the clothing so that the white clothing stands out. So I'm adding a little bit of a background just around the outside of the clothing. And I'm also painting in a little bit of that brown where you can see a little bit of the skin showing through. Adding in some darker brown. Want to make it match the skin tone. Darken up that colour. And because we're making this section very expressive, it doesn't have to be perfect. So So now I'm going in with a little bit of black on my brush, and I'm just tapping in a bit of shadow for where that skin is to darken it up. And I'm also taking my brush and adding a few splatters. So adding some splatters is again going to make it look more expressive, and that is why you don't need to be super perfect with all of these elements. You can also go in with a little bit of the Payne's Grey if you want to add a bit more of a blue tone to the clothing so it's not just black. And you can see how I added a darker shadow around the outside of the clothing so that the white clothing stands out against the background. You can see how simple I have done her top. So I'm just blending out that little part that we did for the background. And don't worry if you get any splatters onto her skin, this is just going to add to the expressive look. So now we're going to go in and start to work on the hair. And for the hair, we're going to be pretty much using the exact same colours. So I'm going to be using the sepia, a bit of the yellow ochre, the black, and also the burnt umber. So those exact same colours. And I'm just starting off with a mixture of the burnt umber and the sepia. And I'm just using a very light diluted wash. And I'm just basically starting off by marking in the shape of the hair. So I'm just blocking in where the hair is at the moment, using a very light wash of the sepia with a lot of water mixed in. And then I'm going in with some more intense sepia and tapping that onto the wet watercolour to get in those darker areas. And we want the hair to be very expressive, so we're going to be using the wet and wet technique a lot. And we're just going to be quite loose and very flexible as we're painting in the hair. Try not to overthink it. I'm tapping in some black as well, where the really dark shadow is. The hair is really dark alongside her face, so we need to make sure that we add in the shadows right around the left hand side of the face. So I'm tapping in some more black, and you can mix the black in with a bit of the sepia as I have done, so that it looks more of a natural colour, because sometimes flat black on its own can look a bit flat. And as we get towards the edge of the hair, I'm doing these individual little curved shapes to give the look of that afro texture for the hair. So I'm carrying on and adding a nice dilute wash further around the right hand side of the hair. You can see I'm being very quick, very loose with it. Not adding in really any details at the moment. I've switched over to a larger brush to make it faster. And I'm just going in with some darker sepia wherever I can see the darker shadows and just adding it to that lighter wash. Now you can get really creative with this step. You can get as creative as you want to be. You can add lots of different techniques to the hair because we want it to be expressive. You can really test out your expressive watercolour techniques. For example, using salt in the hair to give it a really starry look, to make it look very snowy and interesting. You can tap in water drops to give cauliflower effects, which look really cool. You can add a lot of splatters, it's really up to you. So I'm just really adding in a base wash throughout the main part of the hair, and then as we get towards the edge, I'm doing these little detailed little curls because we need it to look like a realistic hair texture. So we need to make sure we add in these little tight curls and be quite random with it so it doesn't look uniformed. So you don't want to do every curl the same. Also mixing in a bit of yellow ochre so you can see that we've got a few different colours and shades, and we've got a lot of contrast in the hair. And so we've already blocked in the main mass of the hair. See, I'm adding some splatters. If you don't like any of the splatters that you've got in, then whilst it's still wet, you can easily remove it with a tissue like I did. So now I'm going to start to build up some of the darker shadows. because everything's quite light at the moment. So whilst the paint's still wet, I'm going in with some black and I'm just adding this to the darkest areas of the hair. And because the paper is still wet, it will nicely soften out. I'm adding some more black along the left-hand side of the face. Being very careful as I get towards the edge of the face, that I don't accidentally add the black onto the skin. And with the expressive hair, you can do it in one layer or build up multiple layers. I try to keep as few layers as possible, because if you overthink it and start doing lots of layers, then you lose that natural looseness of the watercolours. You kind of just want to let them do their thing a little bit. But it is important that you get the contrast in the correct place, so you get those shadows where they need to be, and you leave the highlights as well. And you can see I mixed in some more yellow ochre into certain areas to give it more vibrancy as well. So I'm just going to continue to build up the darkest shadows wherever they need to be in the hair. Again, just using a mixture of black, and you can mix in a bit of sepia if you want to. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now, another expressive watercolour technique that you can use is bleeding out edges so that they just sort of fade away. So you want some edges to be defined, and then you want some edges just to sort of fade out and lose themselves. So to do that, I take a clean damp brush and I just pull on the watercolour, just like I'm doing here. And the watercolour will just start to bleed into where that wet area is. And so the edge will become softer, and again it will add to the looseness of the watercolour painting. So I added in a bit more yellow ochre to the right hand side of the hair. And once again I'm just building up some dark shadows, adding in a few little individual curls as I drop in this darker paint so that it has the hair texture throughout the whole of the hair. You can see it looks really cool around the edge of the hair because we've got the lighter washes and then we've got darker washes, and you can see that there's a lot of layering going on, which makes it look really cool and really interesting. We've got in some nice splatters, so the hair looks realistic, it has a realistic texture, but it's very expressive, and it makes the painting look more interesting than if it was all just super realistic. I like mixing in these different elements, these different styles. So now I'm going to go in and add in some more curls going over onto the face, over onto the right eye, using a smaller brush to tie in the hair with the face. So I'm going from the hair over onto the face to try and tie everything together. Try not to go overboard with this step. So I'm just going to continue to add a couple more strands of hair using the dark black. Remember, try not to work on it too much. You don't want to overdo the hair. Less is more with this sort of style. It can be very easy to overwork the painting and for it to go from looking really nice, loose and expressive to it looking very stiff. So if you're happy with it, leave it. Don't go in and mess with it. I'm just tapping in some water drops. And the paint will move around and look very different when it's dried compared to when it's wet, because as the colours bleed and as these water drops mix in with the watercolours, it's going to change it a lot and the pigment's going to move around a lot. So don't be surprised if when it dries it looks very different to what it does when it's wet. Especially if you've got a lot of water down and your paper's really wet. The wetter the paper is, the more the watercolours are going to move as they're drying. And so the more different it will look as it dries. Just adding a few more details around the edge of the hair. Using my smaller paintbrush. So as you can see, I've waited for that layer to dry and it looks completely different now it's dried on that right hand side than it did when it's wet. It's mainly because I used a hairdryer to actually dry it because I didn't really want to wait. So if you use a hairdryer, it's going to really look different because it will push the colours around, but it won't look as different if you wait for it to dry naturally. And so I'm just going to go in and build up another layer. Just adding a bit more detail. But I'm not going to do too much. I'm going to add some splatters. And this will be the last layer that I do on the hair. And now I don't want to cover up all this really nice light highlights that we've got on the right hand side. I think they look really interesting. So we're just going to use the second layer to build up texture over the top of those highlights. And I'm using the same colours that we used for the first layer, just building up another layer. Once again, focusing on adding the dark colours to the shadowed areas using the black. Going in with some more black. This time I'm using black on its own to get it really dark. As you can see, we did a really nice job on the left hand side getting in those really dark shadows around the face. It looks really nice. So I'm just going to continue to build up some more shadow until I'm happy with how the hair looks. And I'm just going to finish off with the hair by adding in some splatters. And I'm just going in with the yellow ochre because I want to add some lighter splatters to the hair and add a bit more vibrancy. So I'm just going in purely with the yellow ochre I'm just taking my brush and splattering this all over the right hand side of the hair, and also a bit on the left hand side and over onto the background. So I'm just going all the way around the hair. And because the right hand side of the hair is still wet, the yellow ochre will bleed out a lot more than it is on the left hand side, because the left hand side of the painting is dry. But I'm just going to build up more and more splatters. And so that is it for this part, and in the last part of the series we're going to add in the colour pencil to build up some detail and definition. So I'm going to be starting off with my white coloured pencil, and this is actually the Caran d'Ache coloured pencil, but you can use any white pencil that you have. This was just the only white pencil that I currently had on hand. So you can use the white Prismacolor, Polychromos, whatever you have. And I'm going to use this pencil. I've got it in a pencil extender because the pencil's really short. And I'm just going to take this, and you'll only use your colour pencils once you've let the previous layers of watercolour completely dry. So you want your painting to be completely dry. And I'm just going in with the white first to add in the highlights. So this is great if you accidentally went over an area that was meant to be really bright and you've darkened it up a bit too much. So I'm just working on the nose, and I just went in there with a bit of beige and the brown ochre to tone down where I added the white, because it got a bit too light. Or if you add in the white to an area where you shouldn't have, you could always go in with an eraser and just remove it. But I'm mainly just starting off with the white pencil for now. I'm going in with the left eye and just brightening up the white of the eye and going over those couple of highlights that we preserved. And I'm going to repeat the same process for the other eye again, going in and brightening up the white of the eye and the two little highlights. You can see that I've got my pencil nice and sharp to help prevent it looking grainy. If you have a blunt pencil, then it won't get into all of the dips and texture of the paper, and so you'll have a grainy look. I'm getting in the highlight in the middle of the cheek that's quite bright. If you want a really bright highlight, keep layering over it more and more, or apply a bit of pressure. Now I'm going in with the Prismacolor beige, and this is lighter than the majority of the skin, but it's not as bright as the white, so this is good for getting in more subtle highlights. So I'm just looking at the reference and identifying any areas that need to go lighter than I have currently got them at the moment. So now I'm switching over to the colour Bistre, and this is a Polychromos pencil. It's a very light brown. And I'm just using this to tone down some of that beige, especially where we go right to the left hand side of the face where it meets with the edge of the face, because it will get darker and darker as we get towards the edge of the face. I'm also using it for the cupid's bow underneath the nose, and you can use the beige to blend out any graininess as well. The beige is a great colour to blend out your colour pencil if it looks a bit grainy. Now I'm switching back over to the white, and I'm just using the white on the chin. So the lightest areas on the face tend to be the top of the cheek, the middle of the nose, the tip of the nose, above the lips and the chin, and also the centre of the forehead. So those tend to be the lightest areas on the skin. So if you need to tone down the whites, you can always use the beige. And really we're just using the coloured pencils just a little bit to add a bit of definition and just to add some shadows and highlights. We're not adding them all over the skin. I'm adding a little bit of the Bistre just on the cheek, where the contour for the cheek is, just to darken it up on the right hand side of the face. So again, this is the colour Bistre, which is a very light golden brown tone. Also bringing that colour down by the chin and just under the lips. Going back to the Cupid's bow and along the side of the face. You don't have to use much of the colour pencils if you don't feel like you need to. Colour pencils are just great because it's great having more control with the pencils. They are a lot easier to control than watercolours. So if you do need to tweak anything or fix anything, you've got the security of the colour pencils to help you get a bit more definition, or to tweak a certain area of the skin or add in the highlights, and you don't have to worry about getting harsh edges or anything like you normally do with the watercolour. Now to create some darker shadows, I'm going in with the dark brown. This is a Prismacolor colour, but you can use any brand that you have. There's no particular reason why I'm using some Polychromos, some Prismacolor and some Caran d'Ache. Again, it's just the colours that I have on hand. So for example, I have a dark brown in a Prismacolor, but I didn't have a Caran d'Ache dark brown or a Polychromos dark brown. So you can use all Prismacolors, all Polychromos, whatever you have. So once I lay down a bit of the dark brown, I go over with the Bistre just to blend and soften it out. Because sometimes the beige is too light if you're trying to blend out the darker colours. So to blend out colour pencil, use one grade lighter. So for the dark brown, I'm using the Bistre. If I wanted to blend out the Bistre, I'd use the beige. And if I wanted to blend out the beige, you could use the white. But normally the beige wouldn't need blending out because it's quite a light colour. So now I'm going back in with the white and I'm just brightening up above the lips. As I said, this is one of the brightest areas of the face. So I'm just simply adding some white above the top lip. And just at the corner of the mouth as well. Also, I'm going in and I'm adding some highlights to the bottom lip and to the teeth, particularly in the middle of the bottom lip. So most of the highlights are on the bottom lip, and I'm just doing little lines in the middle of the bottom lip to give the look of highlight and shine to the lips. Adding a little bit of highlight to the top lip. Now I'm going back in with the dark brown for the forehead and a bit of the black, just to transition from the hair into the forehead a little more gradually. So you can see how using those colour pencils has just helped to add a little more definition to the face. I won't be using the colour pencils really on the hair because we want that to look expressive. We don't want to add really a lot of detail or definition to the hair, otherwise it will start to look realistic. You can use the colour pencils a bit on the shoulders and the arms and the neck. I'm using the black at the moment just to darken up the eyes and the eyebrows. Particularly where the pupil is, you'll want that to be really dark, so you can go in with the black and just darken that up at the top of the iris and for the lash line. You can use the black as well on the nostrils if you feel like they're still a bit light. Now I'm going in with the colour Caput Mortem Violet. And I'm using this on the lips for the shadowed areas. This is like a plummy sort of neutral reddish tone, reddish browny purple. I'm also using the black. You can use the dark brown to further darken up the right hand side of the left hand side of the mouth, particularly the top lip. So I'm only using a couple of different colour pencils for this. As you can see, I've not used lots of different watercolours or lots of different colour pencils. So you can achieve a painting like this with not many different colours. Now I'm going to go in with the white gel pen and just use this to get in the brightest highlights. So I'm going to be using it for the highlights in the eyes. And you can use it for the highlights in the nose or the mouth. Wherever you think you need to brighten up. I'm particularly using it for the highlights in the eyes, in the tear duct, in the inner corner of the eyes. Just going to switch my white gel pen to a new one because the other one had run out. There we go, that's a lot better. And it just helps to make the painting pop more because we've got really bright highlights in there, so it gives it more contrast. Tapping the white gel pen in the centre of the nose, on the mouth, in the middle of the bottom lips. Gonna add a bit to the tip of the nose and to the top of the cheeks. And so this is the final step in this painting and colour pencil tutorial. As you can see, we didn't really do much with the colour pencils. It's just to add a bit of detail. It's mostly a watercolour painting. I really hope you enjoyed following along with this tutorial. And you enjoyed mixing these two styles and these two mediums. Add in a bit of white gel pen to the chin. Making some final adjustments, but here you can see the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed following along with this tutorial series, and I hope you like how your painting turned out. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial series. Bye everybody.